Will Stuff, conservativereport.org. We have joining us Joe Cunningham. I've picked up quite a few pieces of his on Red State. Joe, thank you so much for stopping by.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, you wrote a story on Red State about National Review Online doing a hit piece against Matt Bevin. When you first read the National Review Online article, what was your initial reaction?
Well, in retrospect, I wasn't sure if I was maybe too harsh in calling it a hit piece. It was clearly done in favor of Mitch McConnell, and it was kind of unfair to Matt Bevin. The original piece referred to a couple of statements that Matt Bevin had made, and one in particular that really stood out to me was when Matt Bevin had said in this video clip, and in the story, Jonathan Strong, who was at National Review and is now at Breitbart, wrote that that members of McConnell's campaign had actually given him the video. So right there, that was kind of a red flag. But one of the statements he made was that there's too much partisanship in Washington, D.C., and that essentially, that we should be working to fix this. We shouldn't be voting along party lines. We should be voting on what's right for America. And I don't know any voter, Democrat or Republican, who who really kind of disagrees with that at heart, because everybody feels that the issues they support are what's best for the country. What it was clear that McConnell's campaign was trying to do by getting this to the National Review was to paint in a light of, this guy's not going to be a good Republican. He's going to want to capitulate. They're accusing him of doing what Mitch McConnell has done for the last few years. And really, what I read into Bevin's statements, and when I looked into it, and what I saw was that Bevin was saying, okay, clearly the vote with the Republicans 100% of the time, or vote with the Democrats 100% of the time, hasn't worked. We're a very divided Congress at very much of a standstill now. And what Bevin is saying is, okay, let's stop. When we're being told to vote with the Republicans, that got us TARP, Medicare Part D. It's given us Common Core. It's given us all these things, big government republicanism, just because, and Republicans are expected to go with it because it's Republicans who are engineering it. And that's what Bevin, I think, in that quote was saying wasn't right.
You know, it's interesting. If you have followed this campaign for quite some time, and so for people who are listening who are unfamiliar with the way the McConnell camp operates, is that they pretty much follow Matt. They have an operative following Matt Bevin every single place he goes, videotaping and recording every single word he makes in public, and then they go back to their lab, they slice it, they dice it, take out what they like, that they think they can use, and disregard the rest. It's no different than the New York Times doing this to the average conservative or Republican.
That's absolutely right. And there was an interesting statement made on Twitter, and I can't remember who said it. Somebody had said the National Review is at a point where they have to make a choice. They're really at a crossroads right now. Do they go back to the activism, the right-leaning activism that they became known for, or do they go to as a straight news outlet, which runs the risk of, being a straight news outlet runs the risk of leaning to the left, because typically, and me being a journalist, and it was how I was trained even in college, was the way you're trained. Journalism typically causes you to lean left. The National Review was known as a right-wing publication, and for the most part still writes from a very Republican perspective, but we're getting to the point where NRO is it Republican or is it conservative? And more often than not, it's the Republican. It's becoming sort of the thing that Bevin was actually talking about, where you support Republicans 100% of the time, no matter what. And I think we need to get to the point, not just as conservatives, but as American voters, both sides of the aisle, we have to stop and think, okay, do we go for something because our party wants it, or do we go for something because it's right?
You know, it's interesting how you bring that up about bipartisanship and working together. I think we're seeing a big paradigm shift, and I've mentioned this before, that 30 years ago during the Reagan administration, regardless of what you believe about Tip O'Neill or not, I believe he hated Reagan and he fought him tooth and nail, but at the same time, so did Reagan. Reagan fought him tooth and nail, and they were forced to come to an agreement that actually had mutual benefits for both parties, and Reagan got a good chunk of what he wanted. That's not happening today. And every time we bring up bipartisanship, depending on how old that person is, they remember the Reagan years where they were able to divvy up stuff, and for the most part, the Democrats were left of center, the Republicans were right of center, and they would come up with some decent stuff that would help the country. But that has all changed now. When we're talking about bipartisanship, it's pretty much the Republicans giving the Democrats absolutely everything they want, and the Democrats not conceding on anything. And I guess that's the most frustrating thing out there, is that somebody like Matt Bevin, he'd like to go back to the Reagan years where we're coming up to some compromises, but we're getting something out of it, that compromise. And we're not growing government, and we're not at $17 trillion in debt. We got something substantial here. And I think that's what he was talking about. He wants to return to a time like that. I think I do.
Exactly. And, you know, it's funny that the Republicans in power today talk about bipartisanship and reaching across the aisle, but what they're actually doing really is nonpartisanship. They're not doing what the party is known, what the base of the party actually is. So when Matt Bevin, that's another thing he talked about, was bipartisanship in the Reagan era. He wasn't talking about the bipartisanship that we have today, which is really just partisanship. It's getting the Democrats what they want. The Republicans are really, they talk a good game sometimes, but for the most part, you know, they're really nonpartisan. They show their hand too early, or they don't even deal themselves a hand at all. They just broadcast to the Democrats exactly what they're going to do. They're not going to try to negotiate for anything. I'm a mid-20s millennial. I was born in '88. I don't know. I never lived through the Reagan years, really. What I do know is that you go back and look, and yes, Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan may have disliked each other, but at the end of the day, they were willing to work together. I mean, we talk about how bad this last government shutdown was. There were multiple government shutdowns during that era when those two were negotiating with each other, but they always were able to come to something that both sides were relatively happy with.
And one of the things that's picked up in that NRO piece is that, and especially if you read the comments after it, people that get on there and want to squawk about that and give Matt Bevin a hard time, saying, oh, he doesn't know anything about Tip O'Neill. Tip O'Neill hated Reagan. Yes, that is true. Tip O'Neill hated Reagan. He fought him tooth and nail, but Reagan fought back. And that's the big story right there. And when it comes down to it, like you said, they got something at the end of the day where they both could agree on, even though they fought each other tooth and nail, and they hated each other in the process. And we're not seeing that play out today. And I guess the big accomplishment is that we need another Reagan figure here to force the Democrats to eventually come to the middle and come to a compromise where it's beneficial. And that's not happening right now at all. I mean, nobody's Ted Cruz is the only one really taking on Harry Reid. But again, how much power does Ted Cruz have? He's not the Senate Majority Leader. He's not the Senate Minority Leader. He's just another member of the Senate. So we need more people to go to Harry Reid and the Democrats and get them to give up something, because they're not giving up a darn thing, and we're giving up everything.
Well, exactly. And, you know, that's the funny thing about the way the Senate is right now. You have a man in leadership in Mitch McConnell who's been there since, 84, who, you know, at one point probably would have commanded a lot of authority, but he is disliked in his own state. He is not, you know, really doing, there's no leadership from him now. It tells you a lot about Republican leadership, especially in the Senate, when twice in 2013 you had two freshman senators who took command of the Senate floor and had all eyes on the nation on them. You had Rand Paul and you had Ted Cruz and their filibusters, and not only that, but Ted Cruz and Mike Lee, the third of those freshmen, being able to command it when the Senate wasn't even really in session over the summer, when they were talking about, you know, repeal or shutdown. You know, when they were talking about that, and they commanded, you know, whether or not the people thought it was right, all eyes on the nation were on those three senators at one point or another. And I think that is the most indicative evidence of Mitch McConnell just, it's time for him to go. Now, whether or not the people like Matt Bevin or not, I typically follow one rule. The tie goes to the challenger, because at the very least, if you're getting rid of the guy who's been in the stagnant Congress, you're making some progress some way. But Matt Bevin, from all I can tell, and there's even a new piece out in Politico about Bevin, just came out. I saw it online earlier. There's a new piece out, and it looks like this was handed over by the McConnell campaign too. Is they're calling Bevin, very wishy-washy, flip-flop on the issue of TARP, given his management of investments in the past, and a report that came out from a company that he owned. And I didn't really read too much into the story, but it kind of looks like they're doing the same thing to Bevin they did to Romney, saying, well, he was in charge, so he's responsible for it. But it doesn't really look like Bevin was actually in charge. But, the McConnell campaign is going to do that. They're going to do everything they can to try to shut this guy down and try to really confuse voters, as opposed to laying out McConnell's record and why he's best to put in Washington, because he can.
And I think the good news, though, and I think a lot of conservatives tend to get a little shell-shocked when they see a hit piece like this that could go somewhere, may not go somewhere. The truth is that right now, Bevin's in a position where he's not looking for an additional endorsement. He's not hoping that this group comes up and helps him out. He's got everybody uniting behind him, the Senate Conservatives Fund, the Madison Project, several groups all throughout Kentucky, conservative Tea Party groups, all the same groups that got Rand Paul elected are now joining and uniting behind Matt Bevin. Freedom Works just joining on as well. So it tells me we've got strength in numbers right now, and maybe this would have done some damage to Bevin, let's say a year ago or 2 years ago if they knew he was entering the race. But I'm hoping, and I'm optimistic right now, that it's not going to go anywhere, because we know this devil named Mitch McConnell, and we know what he's up to, and we know how he plays the game already.
Exactly, and what I'm expecting to see is the Democrat candidate, Nancy Grimes. She's still floating around out there, but for the most part, this is very much a Republican race, and I'm very sure it's going to stay that way here in Kentucky. It's just a matter of who can get the upper hand. It's like here in my own state of Louisiana, Mary Landrieu is still a prominent figure, but as soon as we get close enough to the election in 2014, we're really going to see the two Republican candidates here in Louisiana fighting it out. There's the conservative endorsed Rob Maness versus the Republican congressman running for Senate in Bill Cassidy. And that battle between the Republicans is going to be the far more interesting one, I think.
Joe Cunningham, you can check out a lot of his articles online at redstate.com. Joe, we appreciate you stopping by today.
All right, thank you very much for having me.